Welcome to the Manuscript Academy podcast,
brought to you by
a writer
and an agent
who both believe that education is key.
The beauty is the people you meet along the way,
and that community makes all the difference.
Here at the Manuscript Academy, you can learn the skills, make the connections, and have access to experts, all from home.
I'm Julie Kingsley.
And I'm Jessica Sinsheimer.
Put down your pens, pause your word counts, and enjoy.
I am so pleased today to introduce our very special guest. We have Ben Orlin here, who is here to talk about a book that I just laughed out loud. And I thought to myself, why didn't I have this 20 years ago? Ben, welcome. Tell us about your book.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. The book is coming out in September. It's called Math for English Majors. And so it takes the idea that mathematics is a language, so you can play with it the way you play with a language. And it doesn't have to be quite the terrifying and intimidating experience that a lot of us have in school.
So why do you think it is that so many of us take math so personally? Like it hurts us personally when it doesn't make sense. Why is that? How did that happen?
No, it's a really good question. I think the people for whom this happens actually tend to be people who are a little bit invested in school. So it's people who enjoy learning, people who read and people who are curious about the world, and they listen to NPR and they want to know things about the world. And they pride themselves a little bit on their curiosity and their intellectual engagement. And then you run into math, which is this very different kind of subject, especially as taught in school. Mathematics as done by mathematicians is a little bit of a different thing, but as it appears in school, it's a very strange world. So much of what we think of as math, quote unquote, is really school math. It's really weird features of the subject that we've introduced just to try to efficiently administer roomfuls of 25 students.
So we usually do this later in the episode, but I would love to ask you now to read your first page, because it does such a good job of showing us how your book is going to be different. And for those of you out there who are hearing math and thinking, maybe I will just skip to the next episode that's easier, hold on, listen to this page. You'll be okay.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. Right, so the introduction begins. I once asked an auditorium of undergraduates to recall their earliest memories of math. One of them shared a scene so peculiar and yet so universal that it burrowed deep into my unconscious to the point where it has begun to feel like a memory of my own. At age 5, the student was assigned worksheets of addition problems. Trouble was she didn't know how to read the funny symbols on the pages, the twos and pluses and such. No one had ever taught her. But too intimidated to ask, she found a workaround, memorizing each sum not as a fact about numbers, but as an arbitrary rule about shapes. So, for example, 8 plus 1 equals 9 was not the statement that 9 is 1 more than 8. It was a coded set of instructions. If you are shown 2 stacked circles, so an 8, followed by a cross, and then a vertical line, so picture a 1, and a pair of horizontal lines, so equal sign, then you must fill in the blank by writing a circle with a downward curving tail. So a 9. With painstaking diligence, she taught herself dozens of rules like this, each as baroque and pointless as the last. It was mathematics by way of Kafka. Few people learn 8 plus 1 equals 9 this way, but sooner or later, almost every math student suffers a similar sense of confusion and resorts to similarly desperate workarounds. Whether in preschool, middle school, or grad school, befuddlement eventually descends, and mathematics becomes, in the words of mathematician David Hilbert, a game of meaningless marks on paper.
I think this is such a great place to start, because you make it right away a story about what it can be versus what it should be. And it reminds me a little bit of, have you ever read Susan Cain's Quiet?
Yeah.
So she is explaining something we all think we know in a way that gives it a lot more nuance. And somehow adding nuance makes it clearer. And I think you've done something similar here too. Can you talk about your approach going into that first page?
I find myself drawn as a writer in a bad direction often towards really high-level abstractions. I want to say, here's the synthesis I've reached, and I've got a big overarching idea. And that's just not the place to begin for a reader. They have not been living inside my head having all my same thoughts, so they don't know what details I'm coordinating if I do that. So a lot of the writing I do, especially because I'm writing about math, which is itself very abstract, is trying to find those anecdotes or moments or stories that have the seed of the idea I want to share. You need to engage the reader in a way that math classes do not always engage their students, to give them something human that they can wrap their arms around a little bit. I've asked that question a lot. Actually, I really like that question. What was your first experience of mathematics? Because it just starts a very different kind of conversation than we usually have about math. To me, that really distilled the experience so many people have with math, if not at that age, certainly by 8th grade or 10th grade or 12th grade.
Yeah, I love so much of this. I have this theory that very few brains can bridge the math, writing, like Rubicon. Like, it's so interesting. Like, how does your brain approach writing as a math thinker?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I mean, there's lots of great mathematician writers out there, right? If you sort of go to the pop math shelf, Jordan Ellenberg is someone who
I
writes books
haven't
very
been
similar
there.
to mine. Yeah,
I know I avoid
you're in the wrong part, Barnes and Noble. Although actually, I'll tell you, it's tough actually in bookstores because Barnes and Noble, I don't know where they get their inventory lists for their math shelf, but it's a weird mix. You sort of got a combination of like books like mine that are really meant to be accessible to a general reader, and books that are, like graduate textbooks on differential equations. It's like not really clear how that shelf has been assembled. Anyway, there's lots of great people who work at that intersection of math and writing. But I do think they're pretty different in a number of ways. One of the differences I've thought a lot about over the years is that mathematical writing, so if you look at, say, a math research paper, it's extraordinarily dense, like almost line for line. Every single symbol in that line needs to be what it is. And if you changed it, it would change the meaning. And you need to take 5 minutes reading every equation. So, one page, even if you already know the material pretty well, will take you an hour. And that's just not how English prose is. Even the densest prose doesn't work like that. There's just more redundancy and more saying something and then coming back and giving a slightly different light on it and then casting a new shadow. It's a different kind of expression. And the English kind of expression, I think, is much more natural for human beings. The mathematical one is very dense and artificial, but fits the material that mathematicians are trying to convey. I love math. For me, it doesn't feel separate from other subjects. Like in school, I just kind of liked all the subjects. I thought everything was pretty cool to learn about. And mathematics was one of those things. But part of the reason I was drawn to writing about it was no one else seemed to feel that way. There were people who really liked math, and often they were a little more specialized. They liked STEM subjects. And there were people who really liked just about everything except for math. But almost everyone seemed to agree math was very separate, very different. And it just didn't feel that way to me. It felt like another beautiful thing that humans had developed to understand the world, and it kind of belonged on the shelf with all the others.
So in your book proposal, how did you talk about where this would go on the shelf? So you could talk about these other math books in the pop math section, which I think is, I don't think I've heard pop math before. I like it.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Like pop science, but less
yeah,
so.
That makes sense. So how did you pitch this, knowing that you were probably sending it to someone who statistically is not that good at math?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I'd done a 2-book deal with my publisher for my first 2 books. This is book number 4. And so this was the second book in another 2-book deal. And I pitched it actually as something which it only very weakly resembles now, which was Eat Shoots and Leaves for math, which I was very proud of myself. I thought that was a very clever pitch. It turned out that book was not really very writable. Because the thing about Eat Shoots and Leaves, right, which is Lynn Truss's book on punctuation marks, and so the comma and the period, and she does these long, beautiful chapters on each of the punctuation marks and just assembles so many anecdotes and funny stories and quotes and little sentences you look at side by side where the punctuation mark has changed. And then you see this delicious difference between the meanings of the 2 sentences. There were a few reasons it didn't quite work to do that with mathematics. But I think the central one was that she, in framing the book, is able to kind of put her arm around the reader and say, it's us weird punctuation people. We love our punctuation and it makes us strange. But, we're co-conspirators in this obsession that we have. And the reader I wanted to reach, that wasn't the case with mathematics. I could put my arm around fellow mathematicians, be like, don't we love our mathematical symbols? And if you do that, mathematicians are like, no, not really. I like the ideas. The symbols don't mean anything to me, or whatever. They're just the vehicles for the ideas. And in any case, that wasn't the reader I was trying to reach. I wanted to reach a reader who didn't already feel comfortable with the world and the language of mathematics. As far as I pitched it, that was how I pitched it. Tried writing that for a little while. This one, I think more than any of my other 3 books, really had to change as I went. And it was actually only after I'd written the manuscript that the title Math for English Majors landed there. And it was my editor's title. And I always get annoyed when she tries to change the title of a book late in the process because, no, I've been writing to this title. But when she said that, I was like, oh, you know what? That's a better title. That's absolutely what this book is trying to be. So I liked Math for English Majors as a frame. But I think the original title I pitched was probably Meaningless Marks on Paper.
Everyone that's been listening knows I've been a teacher. I said it before, but I taught new math, where it's much more story-based. And I do feel for all of us, like every time we can experience something that we know, but then in a different way, that we're coming to that content and we're creating a new story for ourselves. And I think that's what you did very well. It's not your brain that can't do math. You just don't speak the language yet. I grabbed it from your website, but like turning things into story. Right? Can you tell us a story about how your books helped someone within the process of learning math?
Yeah, no, I love getting emails from readers because it's always fun to hear how they decided to pick up a book on mathematics and then what it's meant to them. I'd say the most common kind of email I get is the email from someone who said, well, I got this book because I thought it would be fun to look through. And then my 12-year-old got their hands on it and I haven't seen it in the week
Oh,
since, but thanks for writing something that my 12-year-old's enjoying.
wow.
Especially my first book is called Math with Bad Drawings. And that's one that I didn't think of it as a book for young people. I thought of it as a book kind of like this one for a curious adult who never quite connected with math, but would like to maybe reopen that door. But it's a book with stick figure illustrations and lots of cartoons and jokes and like fun applications of mathematics. So it doesn't surprise me that actually it is a book that really appeals to 12 and 13-year-old readers. Yeah, well, I think that book in particular, the role it plays is kind of mathematical inspiration. It's to stoke your curiosity and get you excited and having fun with the subject. And I think for adults too, I do hear from adults for whom that's something they miss and something they need. In childhood, like people like the things that grow into math, right? People like playing with shapes, people like playing with numbers. And then somewhere along the way, in my profession, we lose people. Something about the process of math education doesn't preserve that joy. And so that's, I think, one of the higher purposes my books can strive towards is helping people get back a little bit of that joy, particularly because I'm not a tutor. I'm not there helping you practice your way through exercises. So, what can you do in a book? You can inspire. We've all been inspired by books. So I think that's something that suits the medium.
If I remember correctly, you said that one problem a lot of people have with math is that there's not a direct application to real life. Like, what will I do with this? And you said some folks were trying to solve that problem by giving people well, you'll use this math in the case of if you own a business and you have this very niche problem happening. What do you think happens when people say, I will make this more accessible and practical and somehow end up there?
Yeah, make this more accessible and practical, and then wind up with and because when you're running a machine learning consultancy, then you'll need this. Yeah, it's
As we all will be, yes.
yeah, right. Yeah, in math education, we've really tied ourselves into knots on how we sell the subject to students, what we promise to students. Because certainly everyone has got the message that mathematics is going to be very useful and powerful and meaningful, and you're going to be using it all the time. And then students look down at what's on their page and they see some quadratic equations and they're like, really? This I'm going to be using? And we also need to own up to the fact that no, not everyone does use that. We all know people who are living lovely, self-actualizing lives and they don't use a lot of high school math, and that's fine. So what are the uses of math? I think in the younger grades, you generally do use that stuff every day. It's easy to forget looking back on what math you really learn when you're in second grade, fourth grade, fifth grade. But it's it's the decimal system. It's a basic understanding of fractions and proportions. It's stuff that you need to be able to cook or to do your personal finances, even if you're not starting a fancy business. And then, by the time you're deep into high school math, it's mostly stuff that you're going to use in professional settings or to access further education. If you want to get a physics degree, or a chemistry degree, you need the math. So this book, I was kind of curious about the middle part, eighth grade math, ninth grade math, stuff that you're not going to use every day because that's not how the gardener doesn't come and say, oh, I've given you a system of simultaneous equations to figure out how much to pay me. It's not how that works. But it is actually really essential for almost any college coursework in any discipline that's quantitative. And, how algebra works really is I don't know what the analogy would be, but it's like reading Shakespeare, maybe. It's something that's very core to how mathematicians see the world. How do we deliver that to students? How do we make that feel useful? What I settled on in the book was kind of the language metaphor, that mathematics is, among other things, it's a language. And I like this because it reframes the question, because you don't say Italian. When am I going to use Italian in daily life? When is that going to come up? Because you're not expecting that of Italian. It's oh, I'll order better lasagna now. I'll go to the Italian restaurant, but this time when I order the lasagna, because I'll have a good accent, they'll give me the nice stuff. That's not what Italian is for. Maybe, yeah. But you learn Italian so you can access a world of conversations that only happen in Italian, right? You've got an Italian Umberto Eco and you want to read the original Italian text, or you're a fan of an Italian football club and you want to be able to talk to fans or read the subreddit and comment, or you want to travel to Rome and be able to have real conversations with people there. So it opens doors to new places. And that, I think, is the most honest sales pitch I can give for algebra, basically, is that there are these beautiful worlds, if you want to understand this weird thing called the economy that we're all swimming in and which tosses us around, or this weird thing like the physical universe that we're all in and behaves in these beautiful patterned ways. Or if you want to access work that's happening now in biology, trying to understand the human genome, or in information theory, or the ways that computers work and social media algorithms, all of that, you need algebra to access that. So it's okay. You don't have to go to Rome and you don't have to go learn how these algorithms work, but it's cool. It's a great place to be able to travel to.
I wish you could maybe choose one of four: math for business, math for cooking, math for, how algorithms work. So you can be a social media genius. Any of these, like, here is the math you will need for this particular thing. I'm convinced people would learn better.
Well, that's my
Yeah.
question. And I think this is the perfect time to ask it. And I was thinking about it when we were talking to you, because we're talking about math and nonfiction. We want to hear too about that nonfiction proposal process. But what for fiction writers? How can we mathematically look at creating a book? And then how can we mathematically look at going through the entire querying process into acquisition where you have that book made? It's a numbers game, right? So tell us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I wrote a piece for LitHub after my second book came out, where I sort of repurposed a chapter from the book itself that I'd cut to talk about a sort of mathematical metaphor for the writing process. And it was fun to get to go and find lots of quotes from writers describing their writing process, see if I can fit it into my kind of map. But one of the really important topics in applied mathematics is optimization. So basically, like making things as good as they can be. So the picture to imagine is basically a giant landscape where you've got valleys, and you can think of each point in the landscape as a version of your book. So down in the valley is like, that's not the version of the book you want. That's the version that has all sorts of structural problems. And then there's hills and higher hills and maybe mountaintops. And ideally, you want to take your book and, it might mean cutting a character or changing a chapter or moving things around or moving from third person to first person. You want to get to that highest mountaintop that you can, where you've sort of adjusted all the choices that you have to achieve the book's best version of itself. And yeah, in mathematics, there are a few ways to think about that process. Basically, the distinction mathematicians always talk about is local maximum versus global maximum. So the global is sort of what you're aspiring to. That is the very highest mountaintop that you could possibly reach. And the local is like, okay, you're on some little hill right now, just get to the top of that hill. And there's a real trade-off there. And which one do you want to search for? At some point, you have to give up on global and just get as close to the local max as you can, right? You don't want to be spending 8 years on a manuscript and be like, in year 7, you're like, you know what? Let me throw all that out and go down into the valley and start again on a totally new version of the book. I mean, well, I shouldn't say you don't want to. I don't want to. I just don't have like the faith in the process to do that. So one mathematical version of this is basically to spend the early part of the process jumping around a lot and sampling different versions. So when you are early in the writing process, you make much more dramatic and experimental changes. And this tends to be how writers think about early drafts. You're trying things out. And then once you've got a sense of those different options, that's when you sort of pick one to start honing and refining. And then you can make what are called, local tweaks or local changes, where you just go to your manuscript, you say, okay, what would make it a little better here? What would make it a little better right now? And that part, I think it's Le Guin has a nice quote where she says that sort of your first draft is whatever it is. Revising is hard, and that's most of the work of writing. But then late in revising, you get into polishing. And polishing is dessert. Polishing is so much fun because you just get to move through a manuscript and make that sentence better and make that sentence better and put a better word there. And that's definitely very much my experience. I don't know what it feels like to write an Ursula Le Guin book. I'm sure that's a really wonderful feeling. But even to write one of my books is like, it's a pretty nice feeling to get to go through and do that polishing.
Can you tell us about your proposal and pitching process?
Yeah. This one, I very much follow the guidance of my agents, who are wonderful. Yeah, Steve and Dado, or they work together. And let's see. So I tend to be a little bit, I don't think it's to my credit, a little bit like a large language model in that I can generate lots of ideas, and it's not clear to me which of them are the good ones. I think I had like 15 or 20 ideas of like, all right, well, this could be a book about math. That could be a book about math. And, at least 13 of them were really bad ideas that we should not do as books. So it's sort of generating lots of ideas at the beginning there, kind of listening to what seemed like the best directions, particularly as someone in the math world. Like, we all just have this blindness to how other people see the discipline. So I really need to listen to people outside the discipline as to what's compelling to them, what stories they want to hear. And then, as I recall, it's been a couple of years since I did this, and I pitched those books in 2019 maybe. But first getting a good paragraph or two that I was happy with, and then building up to 1 or 2 page, and sort of each step going to my agents and seeing, does this look like the right sort of book to write? And then assembling a bigger document, with a couple of sample chapters and a more detailed outline. That proposal also happened in a huge rush. I sort of was trying to write them very quickly, when my first daughter was 4 or 5 weeks old. So that moment was a little bit of a blur.
I can imagine. Let's mathematically take the time where you have the least sleep and you have the most going on. Like, that's a simple equation. Like, you just make the line, baby, common denominator.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a certain amount. Once you're in like the baby delirium, might as well throw a few more tasks on the pile.
Oh my gosh. Wow. So tell us about getting your agent.
That was one of the luckiest and least reproducible experiences of my life. They actually reached out to me. So I got
Wow.
a really nice email from Dado, who's the agent I've been working with ever since. And I'd been doing a little bit of freelancing at the time. And I think he saw a piece I'd written for The Atlantic. I was writing about education and math education for a few outlets. And I think I'd written a piece on memorization and sort of the ways in which it looms in math education. And so he reached out to me and said, he'd seen my blog, and I clicked through, seen my freelancing links, and asked me if I was interested in doing books, which was great. I think I was probably one of the last people through the door in the like blog into book deal pathway. Like this was
I remember
2015,
that.
16. Yeah, that's right. I think that door has closed.
Which is too bad because it was a nice door.
Yeah, no, I'm very grateful for it. Yeah. I have no idea if that works now with Substack. There's a lot of great Substacks out there, but I think it's harder without the possibility of like virality on Facebook and Twitter, which was what I relied on at the time to build an audience. Like the algorithms don't do that now. They want to keep you on the platform.
Well, I think it's so interesting because so many writers say, well, why would I spend my time writing articles when I could be writing my book? And I think they really underestimate how much we think about it on the nonfiction side of I'm going to go out and find a writer who's already doing something cool versus I'm going to wait and see what comes to me. I mean, I've been to interviews for agencies where one of the questions, and I'm so glad I knew ahead of time this was a question, was what are some articles you've seen recently that could be turned into books? And I think it's so, so important for folks in the nonfiction space to think about that. And even in the fiction space, publish something somewhere else, and your odds really increase of folks seeing you out in the world and saying, I want more of whatever is happening here. I want more of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Have you found clients that way?
When I worked with a nonfiction agent, she did it all the time. I'm mostly in fiction
Sure.
now, so a little bit different, but it was very exciting.
Yeah.
She was always looking for who's doing cool stuff in the world and can it be a book? And I think that's such a different and interesting way to go about it.
Jessica is this genius. I'm going to just talk about her for a second that like actually uses math to make you feel better in the querying process, that you can look at this entire creative endeavor in a mathematical way. And then by doing that, you can take the emotion out of it. I nerded out on your blog. It was not about your book, but I thought it was interesting that you took like quantitative, or is it quantitative or qualitative? You say, I was an awful math student, maybe you can tell, about being nice and being kind. It was so interesting to me that you played around with these two words. So you played around with words, right? And the differences of the nuances of the words. And then I was thinking how you could use it for characters as well. But I thought it was just genius.
Thanks. Yeah, that was a blog post I did. I mean, these days I just kind of use my blog to get thoughts through my system. There's a certain number of thoughts that need to cycle through my brain. And so it's like, okay, the blog gives an outlet for them. But yeah, I was thinking about kind versus nice, which is one of those ones where I think I started from the place that everybody starts from, of like, wait a second, like being nice isn't all that great. Like what we really need is deep kindness. And like the thing is, we all have that thought and it feels original every time we have it, but it's actually not original because that thought occurs spontaneously to everyone. And so I was like, well, let me take the other side. Let me set this up as almost a quasi-mathematical contrast of like, what are the features of this category? What are the features of this category? And like niceness obviously is not the deep virtue you want to build your whole life around, but like niceness is, it just makes things go smoother. And when life is going more smoothly, more doors can open.
I've heard it described as an East Coast, West Coast issue. So in California, they are nice but not kind. So let's say they see your car's broken down. They'll be like, oh my gosh, that sounds so hard. Good luck. And then on the East Coast, they'll be like, you idiot. What did you do to your car? Here, you're doing it wrong. Let me do that for you. Okay, you're good to go. Go. And it's so interesting to me because it's like, I resonate with that being a Californian now in New York. But I think it's so interesting how we kind of, as humans, have to talk around these concepts and either make a story out of them or like just juxtapose them as you have to make sense of them. You can't really do it in a vacuum. And I think it's just cool to have a method like you do of going through these abstract concepts and making more sense out of them.
Yeah, for writers, if you look at this as a writer, as everything mathematically, right? Like what percentage are you going to have this character? What is the equation a bad scene needs? I was talking this morning with a friend. Sometimes it's too internal. So the equation is you need to add something. Sometimes you just subtract something. Sometimes you need to, really like get into like fractals and like put tiny little things everywhere. Like something as English majors, we say to ourselves, I'm never using that until maybe you're getting your advanced checks and stuff. And you're like, ooh, that's very big. Oh, that's very small, But really, we should all be doing it daily in our fiction. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I saw a definition of mathematics I saw recently, which isn't the definition I'd always use, but was a cool one, is that mathematics is the classification and study of all possible patterns. I particularly like the phrase possible patterns, because that is, mathematics is about patterns, but then again, almost every subject studies some kind of pattern or other. But what makes mathematics distinctive, yeah, is that it's trying to exhaust all the logical possibilities. So I think of combinatorics as the mathematics where this happens the most, where you've got, some number of words, and there's some number of choices you have for the first word and some number of choices you have for the second word and some number for the third word. And if you could just list them all, you would list all possible books. So this is, I don't know if you know the Borges story, Library of Babylon. It's every mathematician's favorite short story. But it's this thought experiment where he's imagining this seemingly infinite world known as the library. And it's this beehive-like space made of these hexagons. And in every hexagon, it's shelves and shelves of books. And every shelf has the same number of books. And every book has the same number of pages. Every page, same number of lines and characters. And to all appearances, it's just all possible books of that length. So somewhere out there is the one that's AAAA, and somewhere out there is the one that's ABC, 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 and somewhere out there is the one that's that, but with one random K at the end. And what that means is somewhere out there is everything. Somewhere out there are like millions and millions of biographies of me, each with one typo in them, or billions and billions of false biographies of me that claim I did things I never did. Anyway, so that's sort of like the mathematical view of language, is that you're just moving through possibilities. And so any book you could possibly write is already somewhere in that library. And all you're really looking for is clever ways to search those combinations of possibilities. How helpful that is for writers. Like, it's a very beautiful inspirational image. Like, mathematics is always reductive. That's what mathematics does. It simplifies things. It throws out most of reality to focus in on the few things we can quantify and then manipulate. And sometimes that's what we need in life. We need to throw out a lot of the details and just take a big picture, simplified view. You don't want to live there forever as a writer. Obviously, you then need to move back into the details. But especially, yeah, for writers who are feeling lost in the details of their own work, that mathematical perspective, I think, can be helpful to sort of lift you up to a more abstract bird's eye view.
Well, it's interesting because you could do something like, for example, say you're writing romance, which has a lot of familiar tropes. You could say this book is 75% enemies to lovers, 25% forced togetherness. But then if you flip it, 75% forced togetherness, and then they only hate each other a little bit, you can change the ratios of those things too. And you could say, dial up this character's snarkiness 25%, or, cut 15% of your words. I have a client who's a physicist, so I tend to get quantitative in that way when we talk about his work.
That's really fun. Yeah. There's sort of a miracle there in that, like, 25% snarkier, or, it's not quite clear what the units of snark are, right? We don't have like a standard, right? They're like, there's not like a special unit of snark in some basement in France that's like the object unit of snark.
I want to visit it. I bet it's a wine cave.
We just created a new unit of measurement. New York City is 75% snark.
Right. Just, yeah,
I thought you were going to say trash juice. It's a hot garbage season.
The miracle to me, though, is that even though these aren't really things you can quantify, it's actually a great way of communicating often. Like, we sort of know what we mean. If you say 25% snarkier, that's the most efficient way to express the thought, as opposed to saying something like, well, this character could be a little snarkier, dramatically snark. Like, don't completely transform the character, enough that you notice. But like 25% sort of expresses all that much quicker, even though it is a fundamentally qualitative idea. The quantitative version is this nice little shortcut.
Yeah, putting them together, I think, works nicely.
Yeah. And I'm thinking of some books given to me, and I wanted to love them, but they were so sad. And I think, and when the world is hard, and like, if 100% of your book is sad because you're trying to create a point about something, then there's a purpose for it. But like, I always say, can you let 15% light in? Right. And so if there's just like little spots of hope, I think that can make a difference in a read as well. Like, I really love what you said about the valleys and the mountains, right? That we need to sometimes go in the valleys so that we can appreciate the tops of the mountains, right? Like, it's hard to get to the top of the mountain. Sometimes you're to the top of the mountain and it's snowing and you're miserable and you didn't bring a good jacket. So there's so many interesting things around these kind of metaphors that we use. But as you're looking at revision, I think it's just a great way to carve out, movement and emotional shifts and all of those positive and negatives, with a common denominator being like the journey or whatever. So I think there is an equation that we could use. I think it might be algebra, or maybe it's trigonometry. I'm not sure.
I think we could go even simpler. It could almost be like a number line, right? Like, have you ever used Photoshop and you can dial things up and down, but there's 0 in the middle? So you could actually be like, okay, light and happiness, we need way more of that. That's plus 75. This character's annoying, so we need less of him, like 25% less or 30% less of him. And if we looked at it almost as all of these little dials we could move on the wall, which, gosh, I wish that was a way that I could help people edit. I think we could, in fact, look at all of these different elements and tell people quantitatively, I think the problem is this dial here, and I think it's this much too much or this much too little.
Okay, Ben, that's your new app. Go get it.
That sounds great to me. Yeah, it's funny. I like that too. Once you know what those dials are, you've done a lot of the work of figuring it out, right? You sort of know what tradition you're writing in and what are the main things you're manipulating and deciding between in your work. I often feel when I start a new book, like I don't even know what those dials are. I'm just trying to create something out of whole cloth or, carve from that blank perfect cube of granite to try to get the shape out of it, which is a much harder way to create than if you can identify, like, okay, these are the dozen things that I'm trying to tune,
Oh, I think it's way more. I'm picturing it like a piano. You've got your 88 keys and then you've got your octaves. And I think it's like, this octave wants to deal with the following related things. Next octave. And then most of your problems are in this octave here.
It reminds me of people mixing a recording, turn up the volume a little bit on this. Like, oh, let's bring that, bring the piano to the front in this part. Or like, oh, we need the vocals to be higher in the mix.
Yeah.
It'd be nice if writing came with those kinds of sliders, but to make that character 25% snarkier. It takes a lot of skill as a writer to just move that dial at all.
But at least you need to know what dial to move.
Yeah.
So one thing that comes up over and over again, particularly with fantasy writers, is how do you explain what is in your head to a writer who knows nothing about the world you're creating? And this is sort of similar to your big question with your work too. How do you explain something that you know is completely unfamiliar to your reader and keep them comfortable?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, I never thought about the resemblance there between mathematical objects and ideas and fantasy. But it's true. I mean, fantasy writer is almost more like being a research mathematician and having just discovered something new. And that thought is only in your head and you've got to get it out into the world. How do you do that? I mean, slowly is, I think, my main answer, especially when I was writing my first book or two. I thought a lot about very carefully controlling the reader's attention. And so my books are illustrated, and I would use illustrations not just to show the idea, because sometimes I could, and sometimes my drawing skills weren't up to it, or sometimes the idea isn't really all that visual, but I would use the drawings almost as punctuation marks. If I'd just written a fairly dense paragraph that I knew contained the core of the idea, like my generic move is then to write a 1-sentence paragraph that sort of breaks up the rhythm and ideally is a sort of pithy summary of what I just said or bounces off it in a memorable way, and then put a cartoon there. And even if the cartoon isn't the world's funniest cartoon, it punctuates it. It sort of makes the reader pause. Okay, like if this page is half the blank space of that cartoon now, it just forces you to give that idea a little more space. So I'm not sure exactly what the tools are for a fantasy writer to give that kind of room. But to me, it's slowing down the pace and particularly not burying, just at the level of paragraphs and sentences, not burying big new ideas in long sentences in the middle of long paragraphs, then move elsewhere, but giving them short, crisp phrases.
I think it's almost like sensory language in fantasy. If you take a moment from your planet, which is completely different from ours, and describe spaghetti, I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
And it's a little break for the other side of the brain.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that sounds right to me, yeah.
But can you say more about controlling attention? Because that's a really important idea.
Yeah. And when I would edit chapters, I remember particularly in my first book, that's almost always what I'd be doing would be reading aloud and moving through and trying to imagine the movement of the reader's thoughts, essentially. And sort of the way we were talking about earlier, where you're exploring the valleys and the hills, I would try out lots of different versions. Particularly in my writing, I'm writing about math, and there's a lot of jokes in it because I want to keep the reader's attention. But some jokes are too dense or distracting or too complicated. Like this happens to me often, where I'll be like, oh, I've got a joke for here, and then I write it, and it's like a 40-word joke in the middle of a sentence. Like, nah, you can't do that. Like 40 words isn't a ton, but it's too much. It's like enough that you've now moved off of the mathematical thought I needed you to be having to follow this train of logic and into the joke. And so it's like, no, that joke can't stay. Got to cut that. A lot of it was finding ways I could make the joke or add a little levity with 3 words here or with an adjective there or just by twisting a common phrase.
When I was reading your book, I was reading it upside down and backwards. So I was taking in the cartoons first and then going and reading it because I think you gave me the ability to enjoy a cartoon or enjoy your pictures and then go back. I think what you're saying too is that with fantasy, You want to feel smart enough to be able to take in the idea. And I think what you're doing is you're giving us all the ability to take in math in a different way. And I think fantasy does the same thing. We all want to be able to live within that fantasy, but we need to understand it in a way that the right things are highlighted, just like in Ben's book.
Yeah, you need to strategically make the reader feel smart. Or if, as an agent, I feel like I'm going to fail the pop quiz, I'm probably going to reject the book because every writer deserves to be with an agent who would get an A on that pop quiz. But one thing I loved about the drawings was it was these little moments of, oh, I get that. Oh, I'm doing okay. I can continue on. It's safe. Like,
Right,
I liked
that makes perfect sense. Let's go.
I liked the Sphinx with the decimals. That was my favorite because it's like, oh, it's supposed to be a hard riddle. Haha.
Right. Yeah, no, that's great. I'm glad the drawings work that way. Yeah. And I enjoy reading fantasy. Having not written any fantasy, I don't know quite what the tools are in the kit to slow down and give those moments of punctuation and pause where you say, okay, and this thus completes this thought, or, that's an important landmark. I mean, my own naive attempts would probably be dialogue with
I would love
the
to
classic
see you
character
write
who's
some
new
fantasy.
to the.
I think you'd be amazing.
I occasionally play around with fiction a little bit. That's, side hobby more than the professional work of the math books. My writing is better when I'm reading fiction because it just means I've got more interesting sentences and voices flowing through my thoughts.
And just to answer the implied question, usually fantasy writers will do that by zooming way in on a detail. And then it gives us emphasis, but it also puts us back in the sensory part of our brains. So we can almost physically feel it, and that slows us down, as opposed to like abstract concept, which can go very fast.
It's macro micro writing again, which is another math term.
Ha!
Ha!
Yeah.
Look at us go.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, like math, I've heard it described as kind of the study of abstract thoughts, right? It's the study of abstract relationships, you could also say. And that makes it kind of a useful set of tools anywhere, even with something like writing, which feels quite opposite in some ways.
Yeah, if they described it as like the philosophy of math or how the world works in a quantitative fashion, it's so much more interesting.
I know how long we spend in math education because it's something like 2,000 hours over the course of your childhood. It's like a solid working year. So by the time you hit adulthood, everybody spent a year as a working mathematician.
Do you have one last tip for writers before we close out?
Well, the advice to myself, I guess, would be keep working to find the right readers. I think that's something I can be a little too precious about my early drafts and want to hold on to them and spend extra time spinning my wheels. And what I need to do better, I don't know about other writers out there, is just go to the people I trust. I know who they are and ask them if they can take the time to read and give thoughts, even if it's not quite the shape I want it to have yet.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Tell us where we can find you and your book.
Yeah. I'm Ben Orlin. I am still reluctantly on X, and they're on Instagram and Facebook too, Math with Bad Drawings. My website is mathwithbaddrawings.com. And my first book was Math with Bad Drawings. The most recent one is Math for English Majors.
And when does it come out?
It comes out beginning of September 3rd.
Great. Congratulations. This is so much fun. I really wish they taught math like this in school.
Yeah, thanks so much. You both have a future in math education if you decide you want to escape the publishing industry.
We are so glad that you joined us. And as always, we appreciate your feedback. Just head on over to the iTunes store and let us know what you think. It not only helps us make this podcast be the best it can be, but it also affects our ratings within the iTunes platform.
We'd love to hear from you. If you're feeling brave and want to submit your page for our First Pages podcast, you can send it to academy@manuscriptwishlist.com with First Pages podcast in the subject line. We'd also just love to hear from you.
And if you'd like to learn more about the Manuscript Academy and everything we have to offer, just jump on over to manuscriptacademy.com.